It was a quiet evening in early fall, the kind where the golden light of sunset stretches across the sky and paints everything in a soft glow. My name is Clara. I'm 27 years old, born and raised in the small town of Oakwood, Tennessee. It's a picturesque place known for its rolling hills and close-knit community, but also a town where everyone knows everyone's business. My family wasn't wealthy, and from an early age I knew the value of hard work. After high school, while many of my friends went off to college, I stayed behind, taking a job at the local grocery store to help make ends meet. Life was simple, if not a bit predictable. In the summer of 2019, I met Ben. He was 3 years older than me, working as an auto mechanic at a small garage in town. Ben had a quiet strength about him, reliable, grounded, the kind of man who you thought could hold the world together. We got married quickly, maybe too quickly, but at the time it felt like the right choice. I wanted stability, and he seemed like someone who could offer that. Ben's family is American through and through. His mother, Laura, is warm and welcoming, the kind of woman who hosts book clubs and volunteers at every community event. She's always polite, always smiling, but I could tell early on that her smile sometimes masked a deep-set disappointment. Ben's father, Richard, on the other hand, is a different story. He's about 55, with a gruff exterior shaped by years of hard labor. He worked his way up from a construction job to managing a small machine shop before retiring. Richard has an authoritative presence, the kind of man who commands respect even without saying much. You could say he's the silent leader of the family, someone whose word carries weight. Our first year of marriage wasn't what I'd expected. It was quieter, lonelier. Ben, despite his strong build and capable hands, struggled with intimacy. He'd often avoid the subject, brushing off any concerns I had. Every time we tried, it felt rushed and awkward, leaving me with a sinking disappointment that I could never quite shake off. We both wanted children, or at least that's what we'd said in the beginning, but over a year had passed, and there was still no baby. The pressure to conceive quickly turned from a hopeful dream to an unspoken expectation. Laura, my mother-in-law, would drop hints during family dinners, her questions light but piercing. Richard, however, was different. His silence and the way he looked at me, scrutinizing, as if assessing whether I was fit for this family, made my skin crawl. By the time the pandemic hit in early 2020, the strain was starting to show. Ben threw himself into his work, staying longer hours at the garage. I tried to keep myself busy too, but the emptiness in our home was palpable. Every evening felt heavy with unspoken words. One night, after an especially tense dinner with his parents, Laura suggested we see a fertility doctor. Her voice was sweet, as if she was just concerned, but the look she gave me carried an accusation I couldn't ignore. I knew what she was implying, that the problem was with me. I felt a wave of shame wash over me, but before I could respond, Ben snapped. He refused, saying we didn't need any tests. I could see the anger in his eyes, his pride wounded by the mere suggestion that he might be the issue. The room fell silent after that. Richard didn't say a word, but his expression was unreadable, a flicker of something dark in his eyes. I felt trapped between my husband's refusal to face reality and his family's mounting expectations. The weight of it was suffocating. As the months went by, the tension in our home grew thicker. Every time we visited his parents, I felt like I was walking on eggshells. Laura's concerned questions had turned into veiled accusations, and Richard's gaze felt more intrusive, like he was searching for cracks in my resolve. I started to dread our visits, feeling a constant, gnawing unease. Then came the night in September 2021 that changed everything. Ben was out with friends from the garage, celebrating a coworker's birthday. Laura had her usual Thursday night yoga class. I was alone in the house with Richard. I'd never thought much about being alone with him before. He was family, after all, and though we weren't close, I'd never felt unsafe around him. That night, after a long day, I took a shower and threw on a comfortable dress. It was short, but I wasn't expecting company. I headed to the kitchen to start dinner, figuring Richard and I could eat together before everyone else got home. When I walked into the living room, Richard was sitting in his usual chair, but something about the way he looked at me was different. His eyes lingered, roaming in a way that made me uncomfortable. I brushed it off, chalking it up to my imagination. I called him in for dinner, trying to keep my voice light. He got up slowly, moving into the kitchen without a word. We ate in near silence, the clinking of silverware against the plates the only sound. I tried to make small talk, but he wasn't interested. After dinner, I started washing the dishes, glad for the distraction. The sound of the water running and the familiar routine calmed me, but that calm shattered in an instant. I felt a pair of arms wrap around my waist from behind, pulling me close. My heart stopped. I spun around, and there he was, Richard, standing too close, his face inches from mine. I froze, my mind racing, unable to process what was happening. He didn't say anything at first, just held me there, his grip firm and unyielding. I wanted to scream, to push him away, but he was too strong. He covered my mouth with his hand, his voice a low whisper in my ear, saying something I couldn't believe I was hearing. "I'm going to help you get what you need, Clara. A baby." A cold shiver ran down my spine. I felt sick, every instinct screaming at me to get away, but I was trapped. He acted quickly, forcefully, leaving me no time to react. The whole thing was over before I could fully understand what had happened. I stood there, numb, tears streaming down my face. He pulled away, straightening his shirt as if nothing had happened. "This is for the good of the family," he said calmly, his voice void of any emotion. Then he walked away, leaving me there in the kitchen, shaking with shock and disbelief. That night, I didn't tell Ben. I couldn't. I felt a crushing weight of shame, fear, and confusion. How could I tell him? How could I explain what had happened without everything falling apart? I chose silence, hoping it would fade, that I could pretend it was just a nightmare. But things didn't fade. The next time we were alone, Richard's demeanor had changed completely. He wasn't hiding it anymore. He'd look at me with a twisted smirk, as if daring me to say something. And I didn't. I couldn't. This time there was no hesitation. He pulled me into the guest room, the door closing behind us with a final click. My resistance was met with more force, his grip like iron. It was happening again, and I was powerless to stop it. After it was over, I felt something new, a strange, conflicting emotion I couldn't understand. It wasn't just fear or anger. It was something darker, something that made me feel even more trapped than before. I sank to the floor after he left, my body trembling, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The room spun around me as I tried to make sense of what had just happened. It felt like I was drowning, pulled under by a wave of fear, disgust, and something else I didn't want to acknowledge, a fleeting, sickening moment where the intensity of his actions left me feeling something other than revulsion. It was a feeling I buried deep down, unable to face it. From that moment on, everything changed. I lived in a state of constant fear, my nerves on edge every time I was alone in the house. I avoided looking directly at Richard, but his gaze followed me everywhere. He was like a shadow, lurking in the corners, waiting for a moment when we were alone. And when those moments came, he didn't hesitate. It became a pattern. Ben would go to work early or stay late at the garage, and Laura would be off at her yoga classes or community events. And in those gaps, Richard would find me. He'd approach me with a calm smile, his hand brushing against my arm as if it were the most natural thing in the world. Each time I felt a crushing sense of dread, but my body froze. I couldn't fight him. I couldn't bring myself to scream. It was like I'd been paralyzed by the shock, by the fear of what would happen if I told anyone. I tried to avoid being alone with him. I'd linger at the grocery store after work, or drive aimlessly through the quiet streets of Oakwood, anything to delay going home. But I couldn't escape him forever. The moments when he caught me became more frequent, more deliberate. He'd corner me in the kitchen, in the hallway, even in the backyard when I was hanging laundry. And every time, I felt a new layer of my resolve crumble away, leaving me more vulnerable than before. The worst part was the realization that I had started to numb myself to it. The shock wore off, replaced by a hollow emptiness. I found myself dissociating, mentally checking out when it happened, as if I could detach from my own body. It was a way to survive, I told myself. It was the only way I could keep going, keep pretending that everything was normal. Months went by like this. I stopped initiating any kind of intimacy with Ben. He noticed, of course, but he was so wrapped up in his own frustrations at work, at home, with his mother's constant questions about grandchildren, that he didn't press the issue. It was easier for him to believe that the stress of trying for a baby was affecting our marriage rather than facing the truth that something far darker was happening. By the spring of 2022, I knew something was different. My body felt off in a way I couldn't ignore. I'd wake up nauseous, my appetite gone. At first, I chalked it up to stress, but the symptoms only got worse. And then it hit me, with a clarity that made me feel like I'd been punched in the gut. I was pregnant. I didn't know whose child it was. The timeline was blurred, the memories clouded by the haze of fear and confusion. My heart raced as I sat alone in the bathroom, the positive pregnancy test shaking in my hand. I felt a rush of conflicting emotions, joy, fear, relief, and a bone-deep dread that made me want to collapse onto the cold tile floor. Telling Ben was difficult. He looked at me with a kind of hesitant hope when I told him the news, as if he was afraid to believe it. He hugged me tight, lifting me off my feet, his face buried in my neck as he whispered, "We did it, Clara. We're going to be parents." His happiness was genuine, and for a moment I almost believed it too. But the truth loomed over me like a dark cloud, casting a shadow on every joyful moment. Richard's reaction was different. He caught my eye across the room during a family dinner, a small, knowing smile tugging at the corner of his lips. It made my stomach turn, the silent acknowledgement that he knew just as well as I did that the baby could very well be his. He didn't say anything, but the look he gave me was enough. It was a look of possession, as if he had claimed a piece of me that I couldn't get back. The pregnancy was complicated. I was constantly on edge, the stress gnawing away at me. I'd lay awake at night, one hand on my growing belly, wondering what would happen if the baby looked like him. Would I be able to see the resemblance? Would Ben notice? The thought made my chest tighten with panic. I made a decision that night, one I'd been avoiding for too long. I needed to confront the truth, no matter how painful it would be. I knew it would shatter the fragile reality we'd built, but the silence had become unbearable. It was like living with a ticking clock, every second louder than the last, reminding me of the secret that could destroy us all. When Ben came home, exhausted but smiling as he kicked off his boots, I knew it was time. I watched him, the man I'd once thought would be my safe harbor, now the person I was about to hurt more than anyone ever had. He looked up and caught my eye, his smile fading as he saw the expression on my face. "Clara, what's wrong?" he asked, stepping closer, concern etched into every line of his face. I took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the words I was about to say. I'd imagined this moment 1,000 times, but now that it was here, I could barely find the strength to speak. "There's something I need to tell you," I whispered, my voice breaking. "It's about Caleb and your father." The look on his face changed, confusion giving way to shock, then fear. He sank onto the bed, his hands shaking as he reached for mine. "What do you mean?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. Tears filled my eyes as I realized there was no going back now. This was the end of one chapter, the beginning of a painful, uncertain future, but it was the only way forward. I owed him the truth. I owed myself the chance to finally breathe again. "I'm sorry," I choked out, my voice cracking with emotion. "I'm so sorry, Ben. You deserve the truth, no matter how much it hurts." In that moment, I knew we were stepping into a storm that would change everything. The truth, once spoken, couldn't be taken back. It would tear through our lives like a hurricane, leaving nothing untouched. But maybe, just maybe, it was the only way to find a new kind of peace, a peace built on honesty, no matter how brutal. As I finally began to tell him everything, the room filled with the sound of my words, raw and unfiltered, breaking the silence that had suffocated me for so long. The road ahead was dark, and I couldn't see where it would lead us. But for the first time in years, I felt the weight lift off my chest, the tiniest sliver of hope piercing through the darkness. And in that fleeting moment, I realized that maybe, just maybe, the truth would set us both free.